From the racing capital of the world, Indianapolis, Indiana, welcome to yet another fantastic episode of the greatest spectacle in podcasting, the Seventh Gear Over Rev Show, presented to you by our great friends and partners over at KrausMeats.com, purveyors of the finest handcrafted artisan meats and sausages anywhere around, and has always been top quality since 1923. And with the summer grilling season being over and we're looking into the holidays, make sure you go to check out their website and their new lowered prices for all of your holiday gift-giving needs. And then let's not also forget our great friends and partners over at Dick Carriers and Respect Your Package, makers of those high-end breathable men's underwear with ball bustier technology. They are respectfully scandalous and unapologetic. And if you go to their website, respectyourpackage.com, and place your order and put in the discount code RESPECT7, that is the number 7, not the spelling of it, but RESPECT7, you will get 20% off of your entire order. So make sure you check them out as well. Now, today, Seventh Gear Over Rev fans, this is a guy that I met a year ago, and we sort of stayed in touch, try to get together. It's kind of been a little bit of a challenge to coordinate schedules, but I am so excited to have this guy on the show today. I feel like we're kindred spirits in that, we're about the same age. We're from the same part of the country, from the Milwaukee area, grew up at the same racetracks, still hitting it up. But this guy, I don't even know where to start with him. He's a racing historian, an author. He's been in radio. He's got his hands on this fantastic book we'll talk about here in a minute. And shy of somebody like the infamous the guys at the Speedway, how much they know, this guy knows damn near as much, and he's all over the place. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our new friend of the show, the one and only host of the Traction Reaction podcast, Mr. Steve Zautke. Steve, welcome to the Seventh Gear Over Rev Show, my friend. Thanks for finally coming on. I'm glad we were able to finally get it worked out. How are you?
Real good. Appreciate being on the show. Thank you.
Wow, I couldn't be more excited, because every time I talk to this guy, folks, I could tell you, it's like he always leaves me wanting more. It's like there's stories that he winds up telling me that I was like, well, wait a second, I never even thought about that, or I didn't know that. It's like we could literally talk to this guy for days on end and never cover the same story twice, because there's always something going on. But Steve, before we get into the whole any of the stuff with the book, like I said, you're about my age. The Milwaukee Mile's kind of been home for us for forever. Even though we're partial to IMS and other places like that. But where did this love of racing history kind of start, and how did it kind of evolve into where you're at now with the podcast and your radio stuff and being at tracks doing, whether it's Indianapolis or Milwaukee or anywhere else doing broadcast stuff? How did that all come about?
Well, it's quite simple. Was born in the city of West Dallas, and my father was involved in auto racing before even I was born. So it wasn't uncommon for me when we lived in West Dallas for race cars and our race drivers to be over at the house, stopping over either before or after races. And I was raised on it.
Ah,
My father was a movie photographer for Wisconsin State Fair Park Speedway and the Marchese brothers. I don't know if some of the listeners may remember a midget driver named Dean Billings and Dick Billings. Well, their father, Mike Billings, was the second in command, so to speak, on the fire crew at the Milwaukee Mile. And him and my dad and him met one day and noticed my dad had a movie camera and said, "Hey, that'd be really cool if you could like film not only the cars, but if there's like a wreck or something, the fire crew and that cleaning up after the wrecks, and we can use it for training." And soon, sure enough, Tom and Carl Marchese saw my dad's footage and liked it and said, "Hey, whatever you got, whatever you need, we'll be more than happy to help. And if anything comes up where we need your footage, we will." And that did occur a couple times. They had to use my dad's footage. One in which, with the book that came out on AJ Foyt, there's a story in there where AJ crashed his Lotus in 1966, and he was bitching and yelling. It took so long for the fire crew to get out there, blah blah blah, and Tom Marchese was pissed, and he was like, because he took safety very very seriously, and he said, AJ, he said, we were on you as fast as possible, and he goes, there's a guy named here, Bill Zautke, and he's got video of it, or movies of it, and AJ was still at West Dallas Hospital just up the road, recovering from his burns, and said, we'll bring the movie projector in here and show you the movies. And then the following week in Speed Sport News, if you look in there, it says, AJ Foyt apologizes for what he said, about the Milwaukee Mile Fire Crew and whatnot. So, there's situations like that where, just growing up and hearing stories like that, it was really cool just being around these guys, especially, the IndyCar drivers, but also the USAC stock car guys. That my dad came was pretty good buddies with drivers like Norm Nelson and Ramos Stott, the Keokuk boys, whatnot, and also, but
Yeah.
Norm Nelson and Paul Feldner and the guys from the Wisconsin area that did so well in the USAC stock car days.
I gotcha. And talking about Milwaukee, I mean, you and I talked about this a week or so ago, and we were kind of just trying to hone in on a time that we could do this because, like you said, you grew up, right there in
Mm-hmm.
West Dallas. My daughter lives within earshot of the Fair Park right now, and as a little kid, I grew up because my grandfather used to do all the timing and scoring out at the Fair Park. So, from before I can even remember, back in the day when the drivers' wives weren't allowed in the pits, my mom would always tell the stories about how she would sit, on the picnic blanket in the infield, talking with Mrs. Ruby and Mrs. Unser and Foyt and all those folks. So yeah, like you, I've been going to that place, for a long time. But speaking of the mile, and I definitely want to talk a little bit more about the book, but in that conversation about the Marcheses and the, certainly we could go into Ralph Wilkie and the leader card guys and all that stuff. But I had come across a picture just the other day that showed the Fair Park from way back in the day in kind of a 2-up photo there, as opposed to what the Milwaukee Mile
Mm-hmm.
looks like now. And I knew that the Speedway was originally a horse racing track, but holy cow, that grandstand from the early 1900s there that you look at, that was like incredibly, in my opinion, incredibly ornate. How long, I'm sure you know this, Steve, how long did
Well,
that particular iteration of the grandstand last?
yeah, not too long. There was, I believe that one was the one that was destroyed. I want to say right around 1911. Um, and then there was another one that was burned down. So one was taken out by a tornado and wrecked, and then
Oh,
another one burned, and then the most famous one, the iconic one from the '60s, and that with the limestone sides, that was built during the that was a WPA project during the Roosevelt administration, and all the limestone that you saw on the sides and that, if you drive through the tunnel between just off of turn 4, that was also part of that
yep.
project, and that's the same limestone is still there today. And also with the if you notice, some of you have posted it was on Facebook, they were talking about the creek, the Honey Creek that went from turn roughly turn 4 into turn 3 down the backstretch and out turn 1. That was finished in limestone too. That was also part of the project. So they did the grand in the 30s, mid 30s. They did the grandstands, the tunnel, and then kind of I don't know what you would call but kind of finished off the Honey Creek in limestone. That was all part of that project. And then eventually in 1966, 67, when they redid the pit road, they also buried the creek for safety concerns and whatnot. But yeah,
Sure, I
that
would
there's
imagine
been
like
four
bloopers and that
four
kind of thing.
grandstands. Yeah, there's been four
Gotcha.
grandstands at the Milwaukee Mile.
Yeah, I definitely remember the old limestone one before Carl Haas took over as the promoter and then invested the money to upgrade the grandstands and stuff. Because just as a little kid, remembering the limestone men's rooms and the big sliding barn doors that were the
Yeah.
entrances and the exits of that,
Well,
and then even now,
and here's the
yeah, go
other
ahead.
thing people don't realize too is especially growing up with watching those stock car races, those were the days of the old Hemis, and those cars would just they were so loud during the late '60s, early '70s. They would I don't know how much of our hearing was ruined by that, but they would echo from the inside of that, especially if you sat up on the top of those grandstands. it'd get so they would just reverberate, off the top of the ceiling of the grandstands and whatnot. It was quite loud. So it's not as loud, especially now with the cars. Well, the Indy cars are actually pleasant. What's nice about the Indy cars now is that you can watch a race. There's still that that noise factor, but you can still have a conversation with somebody. So
True enough. It's like that was back in the day when, before proper earplugs and you just got wads of cotton balls and you had to shove them in your ears,
yeah.
right, and hope that that did the trick. So yeah, I think I probably have a little hearing loss from all those years at the mile. And it's interesting talking about all that limestone stuff. Even to this day, because I think we just missed each other for the Miller meet earlier this year, but just driving through the tunnel there off of turn 4, just thinking about, with modern day rigs, and I know at the Milwaukee Mile they all come in off the backstretch through the opening in the gate, but it wasn't always like that. Sometimes they were on stock car trailers and stuff going through the tunnel, and I drove through there
hmm
this year, and I was like, holy crap, that tunnel is pretty damn narrow given the stuff that we're working with today. So I'm surprised that didn't succumb to some development, but I'm sure obviously that would have been another big monetary investment. But uh, so now Milwaukee, this year's IndyCar race, fantastic crowd. Obviously, you were there. You were in the media center. You were talking to folks. I was very concerned as a lifelong Milwaukee Mile fan, growing up there, that it might not come back in 2026.
hmm
Thankfully, it did. Unfortunately, Iowa just it wasn't going to work, and now it's back next year with a doubleheader. So, and this better than anybody, it's always been kind of a tough road to hoe to keep a good crowd at the Milwaukee Mile. There's been, a number of promoters, whether it was Andretti Green or it was Carl Haas or it was the Fair Board themselves, and there's always been that battle, with the Fair Board and improvements and dates and promotion and all that kind of stuff. Knowing that we've got that race coming back next year, thanks to a great crowd, in this year's season, where do you see that going? Do you see that being kind of a staple? Because I'm hearing from a lot of other guys that they don't want to lose the ovals. Now, obviously, we lost Iowa, but we're getting Phoenix back. And we kept Milwaukee. Where do you see ovals fitting in as the series evolves here over the next several years?
Well, they are definitely viable, but you have to work at it. You got to have the old fashioned promotion in that, and the product has to be. You have to have a good product, and you're seeing this with NASCAR with the Cup Series and some of these, where some of these tracks there's just not a lot of passing, and it's just cars droning around in a circle. So what's Milwaukee all sold itself as a racer's track where you had multiple lanes. It was a wide track, and there was always good racing there. And I remember talking to drivers, when I first started doing the media stuff that were still around, like Roger Ward and Lloyd Ruby and these guys. I still had the opportunity to talk to these guys and chat with them, and they all said the same thing. A driver's track, they all loved it. The drivers that really the better drivers, the better driver you were, it seemed like the more they liked the track because they could exploit it with their talents. Exploit it to their advantage. Passing and whatnot, and using lap cars and whatnot, and that's very important. Now, I had a unique perspective, working for the mile and being a part of 4 organizations, on the operation side and whatnot. And the problem that we always had with the Milwaukee Mile, and it was kind of an antiquated system, and we'll talk about the Marchese and Wisconsin Auto Racing a little bit later, but they had the exclusive promotion rights, and that was at one point a very valuable thing, because you had all, basically the track was yours, but back then it was a lot more simpler because you would put up some couple billboards and add the paper, and that was your promotion. Because the old man would look at the newspaper on Friday and go, "Oh, hey, the races are in town. Let's go to the races this weekend." Well, those days are over because now Timmy's got soccer practice, and Becky has some type of cheerleader practice, and everybody's weekend is all planned out months, if not weeks, if not months ahead of time. So it's very tough. You have to be in people's mind that way. So what was nice about so that's where promotion is real important. But with the what the problem that we were having with organization was that with organizations promoting at the Milwaukee Mile, we were treated as tenants, and I always thought the Fair Park could have done a lot more to not literally help, but just assist, be a partner, a business partner. And to be honest, the last few boards have not been strong promoters of racing. I don't. They weren't very interested. They were disengaged with the track and with the events going on there. With this latest group that's in there now, it it they've been a partner, and that's been very important to the racing, and you're seeing the results of that. They have money involved, money, they have money in the game, so to speak, and it's showing.
Sure, skin in
And
the game.
they have
Yep.
an interest in the success of the events at the track. So, and I think that's why you've been seeing these dividends last couple of years with the Indy cars, with Penske Entertainment working in line with Wisconsin State Fair. It's been a very good. It's been a good marriage, not only with the track, but I always said for years you need to engage the fair park too. Have those stands open. They don't have to open up the entire fair park, but just have Grandstand Avenue open. Have some vendors there. Have some the beer gardens open, and where people can enjoy themselves. And we're seeing that, and the rewards are certainly being shown.
Well, and I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm glad you said that about this current fair board being engaged and helping, because I think you're right. That's kind of the key to everything. And as you were telling that story, it reminded me of not all that long ago, and I know you know this as well. But my step grandmother for a while was dating Dwayne Sweeney, the longtime starter of the Indianapolis 500, after my grandfather had passed away, and when the Jufrey brothers had had the Speedway in Milwaukee there for a while. Dwayne would always call them the Goofy Brothers, and it just kind of
Mm-hmm.
spoke to the continued sort of mismanagement of that whole scenario. Um, but I'm glad to see that things have at least for this era, this immediate era, I guess you could say, turned for the better. Perhaps we should also consider giving Christian Rasmussen a key to the city for the race that he put on to really keep people engaged this time around.
That was a
Uh,
hell of a and that epitomized what a driver can do and what type of racing you can see at that track. And it's shown that hey, oval racing can be exciting if you have the proper rules package, and not and just guys can pass. So yeah, it was a fantastic race, and I mean you could see that from the media, your regular, TV media, your local media. They were like, wow, that was a wild race. Whereas some of them can be
yeah.
kind of disengaged from racing. They're just used to covering, Brewers and Packers and whatnot. But they were like, wow, that was really wild. That was a fun race to watch.
Yeah, I mean, between trying to figure out which of those sideways moves that Rasmussen had was going to be the one that took him out by crashing, or watching Daly go on the high side trying to run the rim shot around. That was one of the more engaging oval races I've seen in quite some time. Uh, but talking, kind of going back a little bit here. You mentioned the Marcheses, and one of the favorite. As I was going through and pulling together, media assets for the show, I stumbled across this from one of your pages. This great Wisconsin racing fans a Milwaukee Mile decal of just an old school, one of the early era roadsters. There we go, Wisconsin Auto Racing Milwaukee Inc. And my producer JD asked me, he's like, "So what's the significance of this?" And I said, "The significance is that it's cool as hell, and I like it,
Yeah.
and I know Steve does too. But I know you've got a story behind that. So what is the deal with the story here on that?"
Yeah, Wisconsin Auto Racing was the organization that was headed by the Marcheses, Tom and Carl Marchese. They were located on 1200 South First Street. Believe it's First Street, and the building's still there today. It was a pillbox, not a pill, yeah, I guess a pillbox type, 2-story, your typical 2-story South Side house home with maybe apartments, but they weren't apartments. The offices were up there, and then like they had a little storefront. You'd go down there and get your tickets. You could, they were open most of the time, and when, if you were in the area, you could go down there and see what tickets were available, and there was somebody always there, and they were there until the mid 70s, and they moved out on Fairview, which was right off the expressway just west of the ballpark. But Wisconsin, yeah, it was Wisconsin Auto Racing, Milwaukee Incorporated, and then John Cation bought into the organization, I believe, in 1968, and that was
Yep, I
the
remember that.
promotional group that was at the Milwaukee Mile until 1980 through 83. Then when the Jufrey brothers took over in 84.
Yes, the infamous Jufrey brothers.
But
So
that was
I
that was yeah, that was just one of the many. That was a few of the that was one of the few logos they had, and that's one of the popular ones. That's a that's based off of AJ Foyt's Lotus 34.
Gotcha. Well, and I would imagine too that was because that was right in the era too of like Wisconsin Fans for Auto Racing. Because I remember living there at that time. I was part of that organization and
Yeah.
trying to stay involved and close to all that stuff as well. And that was when people were trying to continue to keep the support up because obviously as we've seen things have evolved and there's been newer, better, badder ass tracks built and other things like you said whether it's Timmy's soccer game or Becky's cheerleading and then you've got golf and you've got the NIL stuff, and you've got all these other things that are
Well,
competing, for your attention.
an
Yeah, go ahead.
interesting side note on that, and I was working with another fella who's doing a book on paper tracks. In the late '60s, there was a big move to. They wanted to move Wisconsin State Fair out to Madison, which is not unusual because at State Fair, most state fairs are located at the state capitol. What you
Right.
look at Illinois, it's in Springfield, Indiana, it's in Indianapolis off of 38th Street and whatnot. And it's very unusual to have a state fair whereas like in Wisconsin where it's not in the state capital. Well the state fair moved around in the 1870s and 80s. It was in Janesville, Wisconsin for a while. It was in Madison. I believe it was even like in a Beaver Dam or somewhere for a year or two, and then
Wow.
it ended up in Milwaukee just because it was the biggest town. And it was also close enough to Chicago, and it was right on the lake, so they could bring in ships could come in and whatnot, and they could move produce and whatnot around. So they said, well, let's do it in Milwaukee. Well, in the '60s, there was a big move to move the whole fair out to Madison. And in fact, so much so that the Marchese's they were kind of like, boy, what are we going to do? And they were going to build a racetrack in Salem, Wisconsin. Now, this is one of several that were thought up before Chicagoland, which I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. But in the late '60s, they were going to build a 1.5 mile racetrack in Salem, Wisconsin that was going to replace the Milwaukee Mile if they moved State Fair Park to Madison. Obviously, that did not happen. Money, who knows? Money and politicians got paid off or whatever. Not sure, what
Yeah.
happened, but everything was like, no, status quo. We're going to keep State Fair here, and that those plans were quietly put to the side. But then later, I think it was drag racer Gene Snow revisited that plan, also to build a 1.5 super speedway in Salem, Wisconsin, which is right over the border in Wisconsin, right by the Illinois-Wisconsin border. And that was going on for a while. That was talk of that. I want to say in the very early '90s, and then that went away. And then, of course, then Chicagoland Speedway in Joliet was built in the late '90s, early 2000s. So that super speedway has been bandied around for close to 40 years, and then it was finally built, and it's coming back next year with NASCAR opening the doors again.
Well, that's interesting because I always wondered, you saw Chicagoland kind of just sitting idle, and there too. I mean, I got my Indy Lights rookie test completed there, so I was kind of hoping that it wouldn't just wither away and turn into another part of that whole center point development down there. But um, so I'm thinking about all the stuff that you've seen, between growing up as a kid, having the drivers and crew guys over at your house, whether it was the Marchese brothers, Wilkie, all the guys, Herc and McElreath and all those guys from those eras, even through now. I'm sure you've got a number of crazy stories, but what's the wildest thing that you ever encountered, in just around the Milwaukee Mile, not even thinking about Indianapolis, in terms of like a driver interaction, some weird thing that happened that's just like so
Well,
off the wall, it's almost hard to believe.
one story that always came up is, so back in the day, you would have movie parties. Because it wasn't like it is today where you can just go on YouTube or just turn on TV, Fox Sports One or anything, and there's a racetrack or I mean a race on. It was harder and hard back then to get your racing fix in, so to speak. So a lot of times, especially in the winter, they'd have race parties and whatnot. And my dad would show movies, these movies around town at bars and whatnot. And but we'd also do a few during the summer. And in the early '70s, my dad had a party at the house with a bunch of race car drivers and whatnot, and a big, huge, brouhaha, so to speak. And my mom got really pissed because all the drivers were, everybody was peeing behind the garage and killed all the grass behind there. So my dad caught hell because all the guys were peeing behind which, well, I mean, better than tracking them in the house all day long, and that, and killed all the behind the garage. But apparently, that was my mom was not too thrilled about that one. So, but yeah, one other story was um, Ralph Liguri. So we lived off of 86th in Washington, and this is after a year or two before I was born. Uh, I believe he was driving that red roadster. It might have been the Schultz fueling car. I forget which one now, off the top of my head. But the he stayed over at the house, and it was the old station wagon and the open trailer, and the roadster was on the back of the car, and parked in the backyard, and all the kids were coming over and jumping in it, and pretending to drive it and whatnot. So yeah, the house was a very popular place to be that day, as all the kids are coming over, sitting in the Indy car that was sitting in the backyard.
Seems like your house was kind of the go-to house. It's like that was the happening place, Steve.
Well, it was funny because I was just having this conversation with my wife where somebody, I don't know, it was a podcast or it was on TV. They were talking about people are either were brought up in a open house or a closed house, and apparently we had the open house as opposed to my wife, who apparently was brought up in a closed house. So there's always people coming over to the house.
Yeah, that was always kind of a thing too. Like my grandfather, because I'm sure just like your dad, they knew so many people. It was constant, kind of an open door sort of thing. Everybody was always popping by, whether it was for 15 minutes or a few hours or several hours for that matter. And that's always fun, especially when you get people like that and hear some of the stuff that they've been going through. But I did want to kind of circle back. Seventh year overhead fans, if you notice over Steve's right shoulder there, he's got a fantastic book. And if you can't see that, I have a copy of it right here that he's got his hands on here called Fendered Fury. It's the history of the USAC stock car series that really covers, some of my heroes growing up from Milwaukee. And you've heard him mention some of them already. Guys like Norm Nelson and Sal Tovella and Jack Boucher, my favorite Roger McCluskey, even AJ Foyt, some of these guys. How did this whole book of Fendered Fury kind of come to light? I mean, who had the brainchild for that, and how did you wind up being a part of that?
Well, I've been kicking around the idea of doing a book on the USAC stock car series. I've done a couple. If fans may remember the old vintage Oval Racing magazine from the early 2000s, and I did a two-part magazine article in that on the USAC stock car series, which is pretty much one of the few that was out that's been that's been done over the last probably 20 years. And unfortunately, it's kind of been forgotten. And it's the old adage, to the victory, the history is written by the victors. So, and it was NASCAR versus USAC for the stock car series, and through the early 1970s, the USAC stock car series was on par with NASCAR. In fact, it was kind of known as the NASCAR of the North. So NASCAR, ruled stock car racing in the South, and USAC ruled it in the North. And they had very competitive drivers and cars. And at that time, you had factory involvement between, Chrysler Corporation and Ford. And so you had the guys that were Pontiac was involved, which was, you had Ray Nichols and Paul Goldsmith, and those guys were heavily involved. And Ford early on had, Zico Lubed in the early 60s, and Bill Trainer's group and whatnot. And I could go on for hours on that race team alone. But also then later with Jack Bauscher had some Ford involvement, and guys, and that was how they teamed up with AJ Foyt, because Foyt was a Ford driver at that time. And so you had Chrysler with Norm Nelson and Roger McCluskey. So you had a lot of money being thrown around, as well as in NASCAR. And it wasn't until in NASCAR, or I should say, USAC kind of always treated the stock car series with a little bit of disdain. And the drivers didn't care. The drivers liked it, especially. I've asked a couple of drivers this, and they won't admit it. And I just have this theory that in the mid '60s, sprint car racing was pretty dangerous. You're USAC stock car or USAC sprint cars in 1966. They lost 4 drivers in a year. And you had drivers like Johnny Rutherford, who was the defending champion, broke both of his arms, and a lot of guys were just not, were kind of shying away from it. And the stock car series was an easy way for them to make money. It wasn't, as Parnelli Jones told me about 10 years ago. He says, you can only put your head on the chopping block so many times, and that's what he felt when he was driving a sprint car or an Indy car at certain places. He just wasn't comfortable. He says, he was Mr. Big Shot in that, but he knew that, at the time where I am in my life, I like driving a stock car a little bit more at certain times, and he did, and he was dominant with the Bill Strope and the Bill Strope Mercuries, and he was dominant at the Milwaukee Mile, winning 7 races in a row in the mid '60s. And people still talk about Parnelli Jones at the Milwaukee Mile. But the stock car racing was good racing. It was competitive racing. You had full fields. But Al Krause was track historian before me at the Milwaukee Mile, and my mentor. And Al was, I would consider him one of the top 5 historians of motorsports of all time. He was just very knowledgeable. Anyways, he told me a story. He was down in Indianapolis with Tom and Carl Marchese, and they were at a USAC meeting. And I won't name the person, but his son drove Indy cars later. And he was the director of competition at USAC, and he said, we could really use some help promoting stock cars, because we're putting in good crowds at Milwaukee, and they're almost comparable to the Indy cars. And I think we if we push the stock car series a little bit more, it could be very, very successful. And the fellow said, it was up to me. I would I would, what do you say? Like, it was up to me. I would get rid of those, GD taxi cabs. They wouldn't even be a part of USAC. So there's a lot of people that were not too, thrilled with it. And another person, I won't say, a USAC official, told me when they used to run the twin races, the twin 200s at Michigan, they'd have the Indy cars, and then they'd run the stock cars, and he'd be up in the scores or up in the suites, working the race as an official, and some of the USAC guys were making fun of the stock cars, and he's like, "What the hell are you guys doing? These are our guys. Why are because they weren't the Indy cars. So you always kind of had that in the back of the mind where they weren't appreciated, and it and it showed it showed how uh, when guys like some of the really good officials stepped away, and other officials that didn't have the interests of the series, and it withered on a vine. And it was not only with the races itself and prize money, but it was also the cars. The cars, what you saw happening with the cars, once the factories pulled back from the stock car racing, the cars may look new, but they were still the same. And so they weren't progressing as well as the cars down south. So by the mid 70s, you were seeing a pretty significant gap between the technology of what USAC was running and NASCAR running. So when somebody like Butch Hartman ran down, Butch Hartman, who was always having a beef, and in some cases he was right with USAC not promoting himself, and ran NASCAR in 1975. He was kind of shocked at how far behind he was, because the team was, because NASCAR had progressed that much more. So yeah, it's just unfortunately, I think it's some of the best, not only some of the best looking cars, but one of the trivia I like to say, with the wing cars, with the Dodge Plymouth and Superbirds and Dodge Daytonas, more wing car races were held at the Milwaukee Mile than Talladega and Daytona. Those cars ran, whereas
Interesting.
NASCAR banned them. Yeah, NASCAR. So they ran 1970, and then 1971, NASCAR put a restriction of 302 on, basically only you could only run a small block, and only one car ran as a small block. That's the Dick Brooks. That really cool looking gold and red 22. That car ran with a
Yep, I remember
302,
that
and it
car.
was able to kind of keep up in the draft at Daytona and some of the other tracks it ran, but it didn't have the power to pass. But anyways, that they ran 70, 71, and 72, so they would run at Michigan, Milwaukee, and Pocono. Uh, Look up the box if you assume you guys are internet savvy. Look up the box score for the 1971 Pocono 500 stock car race. You will be blown away at the drivers that are in that race. It is just a who's who of racing, from sports car drivers to Brian Redmond to motorcycle Hall of Famers Gene Romero. I mean, it is just incredible, some of the drivers that were in that race. It just you scratch your head and you go, wow, they really had a good thing going, and unfortunately they kind of screwed the pooch.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the things that really caught my eye about your book, and it was the cover, right? It was Roger McCluskey driving Norm Nelson's Plymouth Superbird, and that was, I mean, he was also the first driver I ever met and got an autograph from, also at the Milwaukee Mile. So I was already interested, and I'd already met you at that point, so I was really curious. And then as I got the book and I was reading through it, it was like, oh my God, there's like some of the guys that I'd forgotten about, or some of the guys that I'm like, I hadn't seen this picture before, or some of the evolution. But, with you, what you were saying about the Superbirds and how they USAC kind of screwed the pooch, it was like they did really have a good thing going for a while there. They had that stretch, but I guess to your point, they just didn't really, the officials didn't really get what they had until they lost it. And then NASCAR kind
Mm-hmm.
of just went exponential from there. But it
Oh,
also
I
kind of
should.
reminds me.
Oh, I'm sorry. I never told you how the book came about. Before I
Yeah,
forget,
please.
because my short-term memory is awful. Sorry to
Well,
interrupt.
it's like my dad used to
But
say. That's quite all right. My dad used to say my memory is really good. It's just that it's very short.
the book. So I was like, yeah, we need to do a book. So I was putting stuff together, gathering information, and I had, I was putting chapter. I kind of knew what I wanted to do with chapters and whatnot. And I'm on the induction committee for the National Sprint Car Hall of Fame, and I always go out to Knoxville for the induction ceremonies the week after the Indianapolis 500. So I guess it would have been 2 or 3 years ago. I'm in the On the second floor, there's a library there, and I love going in there. That's where some of the archives are, and I'm just going in there, and I mean, it's for me being a total dork and geek. It's fantastic because I'm in a suite watching sprint car races, going through archives of racing materials, which is, I mean, you can't get much better than that for me. But anyways, Pat Sullivan, stopped in the library and goes, "Hey, I hear you're putting a USAC stock car book together." I said, "Yeah. I got some people interested in it and whatnot. I had a couple photographers that were on board." And he goes, "Well, so are we." I'm like, "Oh." And he goes, "Yeah." So it was. If you look at the book here, it was Richie Murray. Richie Murray basically took over Dick Jordan's spot at USAC, and Richie travels and does all the weekly reports or the daily reports basically on USAC, and is the kind of the statistician of them. He was putting it together along with Pat Sullivan, who's a historian and is very knowledgeable. And he said, "Yeah, let's get together." And I was like, "Yeah." I mean, why double the work? I would be an honor to work with somebody, with Pat, who's such a who's done books with John Mahoney. He did a Silver Crown book on with John Mahoney, and then he's also worked with other authors. And they did a USAC midget car book, and also the sprint car book. So they wanted to do one on the sprint cars. And then Bob Mays, who works with the American Museum of Speed in Lincoln, he's kind of the glue that puts everything together. So we were able to put this book together, and it was wildly successful. And unfortunately, it's been sold out. We've been kicking around the idea of maybe doing a second printing, and I really would like to do that, but let's put it on, to be honest though, it's quite the big endeavor. So I don't know how I want to do that yet, but it's not a dead deal. But we might do a second printing. But there's a couple copies out there. I think you can still get them at Coastal 181. I think might have some left. So, but yeah, it was a absolute labor of love, and I wanted to yeah, we got Butch Hartman on there, who was a five-time champion. You got Don White, of course, the aforementioned Roger McCluskey, and then Parnelli, Norm Nelson, and AJ there. So, it's like, and then somebody goes, so we put this together, and they're like, "Oh, you guys only like Mopars." Well, it was we we actually had a couple. We had a couple mock-ups of other cars, but I said we need to put a Superbird on there. I thought it was very important to put either a Dodge Daytona or a Plymouth Superbird, not only for just because it's such an iconic car, but visually, and also we wanted gearheads to be interested in this, because I think from 1968 to 1972 is the epitome of stock car racing. With those, with the iconic, Dodge Chargers, and then you had Daytonas, you had those Dodge, you had the Aero Wars basically with the Dodge Charger 500s, your Plymouth Roadrunners, your controversy with, Petty driving that brick of a Roadrunner, and then he went to the Torino. So that's where the Aero War started, because Petty was saying, "I'm getting my butt beat at Daytona and other places because of this Plymouth Roadrunner," which was cool to you and I, but wasn't very aerodynamic. So that's
Right.
where the Superbird and the Daytona came from, was in a way to bring Petty back to Chrysler. So, but Ford Torinos and all those cars are just so iconic, and it's the top of American horsepower, hot rods and whatnot. And we were lucky enough to see those cars on the racetrack. Is just was such a treat, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was just such an iconic era, and I'm fortunate, growing up to be able to witness that stuff firsthand, and be able to get autographs from guys like Boucher and Nelson and McCluskey and, Paul Feldner and Ramo Stott. I remember all those guys like it was yesterday. Now, so for those of you, if you can find this book, I can't recommend it enough. It is absolutely fantastic. The photos within it, the stories, the stat sheets, the results. This is a book well worth having for your library if you can find it. So well done, Steve, on that. Hopefully that'll come to pass where maybe there'll be a second printing of it.
Well,
But
and I was
go
going
ahead.
to say, if they're feel free to contact me if they're unable to find one. If I get enough people interested, I can start building up like a mailing list. That would certainly kind of push me in one direction if we're going to do a second printing. Because as you know, the issue with having a second printing is oh yeah, I want to buy a book, I want a book, and then you're sitting in a with a garage with cases of books, so
Right.
it's not like we can just print off, I just want through 4 or 5 cases of books. It's a lot more than that, so it's quite the
Right.
commitment to do it.
All right. So before we get too distracted on other stories and stuff, speaking of to that point, what's the best way to reach you if people want to drop a line and say, "Hey, this seems really cool. How do I get my hands on one?" Where do they reach you at?
Yeah, feel free to reach out on any of the social medias. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. You can get me through there. You can also get me through my email, which is my first letter and my last name S, and then Zautke Zautke at Gmail. But if you do a search on Google, search me, you can find me. I'm kind of all over the place.
He is everywhere, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, from Winchester for sprint car stuff to Knoxville to Milwaukee to Indy and anywhere in between. You could even find him at DuQuoin if you wanted to. But now that said, just kind of shifting gears a little bit. There's a topic that you and I kind of broached back in May of this year about stuff at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. But before we get into that topic, and it's we're going to kind of go back history wise. I know we've got some of the Millers at the Mile photos with some of the 70s Indy cars, but we're going to go even further back than that. Some of the old roadsters that we saw lined up there in the Miller event. So before we get into that topic, though, Seventh Gear Over Rev fans, if you're grooving on what you've been hearing us talk about with great guests like Steve here and all the others, Derek Daly, whatnot, we've obviously kind of just shifted our focus towards our YouTube channel here recently. I think we're at 33 subscribers right now. And Steve, I don't know what you're doing if you're giving out free books because you've got like 1,700 subscribers on your podcast channel, the Traction Reaction. But we're trying to get to where you're at. So if you like what you're hearing from us, folks, make sure you share us with your friends, like us, rate us, review us. Obviously, smash that subscribe button so you can get the latest from the greatest spectacle in podcasting here at the Seventh Gear Over Rev Show. Currently, we are heard in 114 different countries. We're closing in on 10,000 downloads on the audio only side. We've had some pretty good early runs here as we kind of shift our focus more to the YouTube stuff, but we could certainly use your help, and our show partners, Kraus Meats and Respect Your Package, would certainly appreciate that as well. But enough of that. You and I had talked about this concept that I think I heard kind of uttered out of Doug Bowles, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway president, utter probably within the last year or two about, I think he said something about, sometimes when he's at the track late at night and everybody else is gone, there's nobody there, you sort of hear things. You sort of feel like there's other presence, and I don't mean like Christmas presents there's so many people that have made their name, made their history, gave their lives at that place, and that there may be something to the idea that there's maybe spirits at the speedway. You think there's any truth to that, Steve?
Well, I'm not going to say yes or no to that, but I know exactly what he's talking about. So when I was talking when I worked at the Milwaukee Mile, one of the first jobs I did was I did all the video, hooked up all the videos at that time, which were these old, basically construction like trailers back in the early '90s. So we'd be running. I'd talk to I think it was ABC TV. We'd have the guys run all the coax. Everything was coax back then. We'd run all the cables into the compound, and then me and then several other guys would run it into the trailers and run all the monitors. And we're talking about the old type Sony type Trinitron ones. These things that weighed like 300 pounds and that. But it was tedious, but it was fun. I was like, hey, I'm part of the team, so to speak. And we're getting all just humping. I was a lot younger too at that time, So you're humping around there, and next thing you know, you look, it's like 2 o'clock in the morning, and you get it. Sometimes you just had to just kind of clear your head for a second. So I get on the golf cart and I'd go out on the track, 2 o'clock in the morning, and it's spooky. Let me tell you. Yeah, and so I was telling this to my buddy of mine, George Petrovich, and he was friends with. He was brought up in Speedway, brought up right across the street off of Georgetown, and all the kids knew each other back then, and he knew the Iserts and Rick Duman and some of the other kids, and Roger Ward Jr. was, I think, a little older, but there was other kids that were that were around, and they get on their bikes and whatnot, and they go down to the creek, and there was a way at that time you could get into the track through the creek. Uh,
Yes, I remember
uh,
that.
and then crawl in, and and then Clarence Cagle, whoever would out, but they would say, they would tell me stories. He's telling me stories too. They'd be, it'd be nighttime, and they'd be in there. They'd have that same feeling. I go, yeah, I know, because I felt the same thing at the Milwaukee Mile. It's like you're out there at night, and it's kind of spooky. And I've been at. It's strange because I've been, people that have camped, and I have camped at Road America. It's not the same. It's something strange. Maybe because it's in a more confined area or something. I'm not sure, but I didn't get that feeling at Road America. I love Road America. It's a fantastic place and everything, and it's got a lot of history. But I did not get that same feeling as I did at the Milwaukee Mile, at 2 o'clock in the morning. And he told me he got that same feeling too as kids, and that they would feel those same feelings that Doug was feeling. So yeah, there's definitely something about that, because Milwaukee, with its history in that, it I don't want to say it's spooky, but you get a feeling, and you start thinking about all the things that have happened and some of the unfortunate things that have happened, and then me knowing, fortunately, I know a little more than how some of the bad things happened at Milwaukee, and where exactly they happened, and yeah, you get a kind of a spooky feeling when you're there at 2 o'clock in the morning on a summer night.
So in any of those experiences you had, whether you're on the golf cart, on the track in Milwaukee at 2 o'clock in the morning, or talking to guys like George Petrovich and guys, here at the Speedway, it's like, did they ever tell you, or did you ever feel like it's one thing to say it's spooky or it's eerie, it's just kind of this ominous feeling, but did anybody ever say that there were any like specific things, like they maybe heard faint voices, or suddenly there was a drop in temperature, or a breeze suddenly came out of nowhere when there wasn't any, or it suddenly got calm? Anybody relay anything, any experiences like that, or did you have any of those?
Well, I think they might have, when they were younger. They might have get, but that's part of the thing. When you're a kid, you're more kind of apt to
Right.
feel that. And I was, at that time, I was probably in my mid 20s, when I was buzzing around there in the early '90s, and that late at night. I've been there since then. And yeah, you get that feeling, but no, it's just, you kind of feel something. It's kind of hard to describe, but yeah, there's something about a racetrack at night, even with Road America, where I said I didn't get that feeling, but there's something special, something, that quietness of a racetrack at night. It's just it's almost like a breathing, living thing almost. And I've heard other people say that too, whether it's drivers or people that have stayed there, camping in their RVs and whatnot. There's something not necessarily mysterious about it, but it's a different feeling that you get from other places. I will attest to
Gotcha. So you're saying there's a chance that it could be a deal.
that.
All right. So I got to ask you one more thing here as we're talking about this, because as we were pulling together, graphics for the show, I pulled a couple of photos from the Millers at the Mile event, with the '70s Indy cars kind of lined up all nice and neat, in the front row, and this graphic that we see now, and just the story that we're talking about with spirits and things at the Speedway. obviously the Milwaukee Mile has been around forever, the longest continuously operated racetrack in America, let alone maybe even the world, as far as I know. But one of the things that I always found interesting, and this kind of goes back to our era of the heyday, like especially when they would run multiple races at the Fair Park in Milwaukee. A couple during Fair Week, you'd have the Rex Mays, 150. Then you'd also have the Governor's Cup 250 late in the year in September. But one of the things that I always loved about the Fair Park is that there was that incident where I think it was Duke Dinsmore and Rex Mays. Dinsmore, if I remember right, and maybe that's not the correct driver's name, but got thrown from his car at Milwaukee, and Rex Mays got out to help him, and they had erected a plaque up in the wall in turn one to kind of commemorate that, which is part of the reason why they had the Rex Mays Classic. Last time I was there, I don't think that plaque is there anymore in turn one. What did they do with that? Is it still there? Did I just miss it?
Yeah, there's actually a little bit of a story. I won't drag it on for too long, but actually, yeah. So in 1948, Duke Dinsmore at that time the track was dirt, and Duke hit the wall, and he got those guys did not wear seatbelts in those days. Some did, but most did not, and he got thrown from the car. He was on the track, and Rex Mays came up on the scene, and he saw Duke laying there, and he pulled, he turned his car into the wall, and he got out and was flagging the drivers away from Duke, and it was a brave thing for him to do, and it had not been done before. Well, then, sure enough, a year and a half later, they're racing at Del Mar, California, which is basically a horse track. It was also dirt, but they didn't do they didn't really convert it much. It still had the 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 furlong, I guess, markers were there, and
Yeah, yeah.
Mays kind of spun, got on the inside, hit one of those furlong markers, and the car twirled, and he got tossed out onto the track. And he got ran over, unfortunately, by several cars, and he was killed. So the irony was, he was killed in basically an accident very similar to the one that he was accredited with saving Duke. So, Tom Marchese said, we need to dedicate, do some type of remembrance for Rex, and so in 1950 they put up a plaque, and it was on the outside where that happened in turn one, kind of almost at the apex, kind of. And years later, in the 60s, it was stolen. It was gone for many years, and it was never put back up. Uh, then it was later put back up, and then when they put in the softer barriers, they took it down. And it's on a. So what we did is we put it on a kind of like a mount, and we would put it outside the media center on display, including the Miller Meet. Unfortunately, I did not see it last year. I can call my buddy Will Fuentes at the Wisconsin State Fair Park and try and find out where that is. But yeah, it was put on a kind of a mounting where that plaque is today, and there's two plaques. There's a new plaque that's on there, and then the original plaque. I'm not sure ended, but on that original plaque, cars actually hit that wall, hit that plaque a couple of times, and it's kind of bent up.
Wow.
So yeah, if you look
Wow.
at if you gotta look kind of hard at, but if a photographer is shooting in turn one at cars, if you look, you'll see you see a little black thing on the wall. That's it. So it was, as you know, it was probably about, I don't know, 18 inches by 12 or something, and it was a brass
Right.
plaque in the wall.
Yeah.
uh, kind of like you'd see at Teddy Roosevelt got shot at Milwaukee in 1912 downtown, and there's a plaque at where he was shot. The original motel is gone, but the Hyatt's still there. If you go into the foyer, there's like a brass plaque in there. It's one of those brass plaques you see. It's very similar to that. So
I gotcha. So, man, I feel like we could talk for literally days on end, Steve, because I feel like we're barely scratching the surface. But I also got to know. I mean, we talked about, what the impetus of the book Fender Fury was. What was the impetus to go ahead and start the Traction Reaction channel for your podcast? And when did that all
Well,
begin?
yeah, thanks. So I worked at the Milwaukee Mall in operations. I worked as the historian, and I would help out, with pre-race stuff and whatnot. And Jim Tradle and I would,
Oh
work
man,
on
Jim
the
Trado.
programs. Yeah, Jim Tradle was my boss. Still involved in auto racing, and just was so much fun. So much. It was a great team that we had at the track, and it was, I always like to say the sanctioning bodies, you know, loved us in operations and whatnot. They never had an issue. It was unfortunately with the Milwaukee Mile in the early mid to late 2000s was, it was a money issue, cash side with the office and some of the promoters. But from an operations point of view, they never had any complaints. So we kind of took pride in that. But no, so one of the things they opened up a sports radio station, or I should say a radio station that switched over to sports radio, and they were interested in having Jim do the come on do a racing show with Steve Sparky Pfeiffer, and Jim was like, "Well, I already have a show, and I'm on another station." I said, "Why don't you try Steve Zautke?" So I came in, and me and Sparky hit it off. I listened to Sparky. I kind of knew his personality. I knew what he wanted, so I kind of had an advantage that way. And we just hit it off. And there's certain guys, as you know this, as you do media and that, and if you've done radio in the past or TV, there's certain guys you hit it off and you got a good rapport with, and that's the way it was with Sparky. So initially, I was working, I was on radio through my duties with the Milwaukee Mile, on the show, and then eventually I got hired by the radio station, and I did that for about 15 years. Through COVID, through up until 2001, and then the station pulled back and was doing to all syndication, sports syndication, got rid of all the local programming. So I was like, what am I going to do? So I thought, well, I still want to be involved and I still have something to say. So I started a Traction Reaction YouTube channel. And I started to do kind of a radio show thing. And to be honest, I was like, well, I don't want to really to be honest, I didn't want to do a weekly show. So I'm like, you know what? I like doing, and you start looking at hits and whatnot and what people are liking. And so I'm like, they really like the historical stuff, and they like the race reports or at the track. So that's primarily what I do now. I do a lot of historical stuff. I'll do some interviews with drivers, but unfortunately, there's so much stuff out there with drivers. I don't get a lot of hits on that, but I get hit silly stuff like paddock. I do this thing called a paddock drive, where I basically just stick the camera out the window and I'm driving through the paddock and just shooting all the race cars and the haulers and that. People love that because I guess if you're not able to go to the track, it kind of gives you an inside look at who's there, and who knows, maybe I've actually had comments. I've been, hey, you got me at 9 minutes and 14 seconds, you got me walking through the paddock or something. So there's some of that. So you never know what the public wants, and I just try and kind of steer my content towards what they want. So they like historic stuff, they like the paddock stuff that I do, and I kind of stick to that, and I do reports. I did like Milwaukee Mile. One video that sticks out I remember is they're doing more camping at the Milwaukee Mile. In the past, you would do their camping. People don't realize, if you at the Milwaukee Mile, alongside the expressway there's this huge parking lot. That's
Motorhome
actually a
lot, yeah.
state park. Yeah, and people don't really. So if that's where you would camp at the Milwaukee Mile, was outside the track, almost on the other side of a street, and you're kind of almost remote. You're probably almost a good 3/4 of a mile away from the racetrack. Well, the last couple of years, and once again, tip of the hat to State Fair Park. And Sherry Black and her team going, well, we should maybe do some camping inside the track, not only for the drivers and some of the car owners and whatnot, by the paddock, but maybe like in turn 3 and 4, and that's what they've been doing, and every year it gets a little bigger and bigger. So I did a kind of a video on the camping there and how some of the people liked it and whatnot. So, just stuff like that, just trying to give people a kind of an insider look, and trying, and same thing with if you follow me on Twitter, if I'm reporting from a racetrack, I'm trying to give you information that you're not seeing on TV. I don't understand people who just regurgitate stuff on Twitter that you're seeing on TV. Most people can tell, whether it's a football game. Oh, now it's 3rd down and 10. Well, everybody knows that. Why are you wasting up my
Right.
bandwidth? Stuff like that. But
Yeah.
try and give you information. Like the one I tweet the most is like during the Indy 500, especially if I'm up in the media center, because I'm trying to give you information, stuff I'm seeing maybe on pit road or other stuff that maybe is not showing up on TV, that kind of stuff. So
I gotcha. And that's kind of, that was my thinking too when we started this Seventh Gear Overrev show. Is like, as a former pro driver myself, it's just like I got sick of hearing the typical race broadcast, was asking all the softball questions. It's like, what's it feel like to do 200 miles an hour? What did it feel like when you hit the wall? It's like, okay, well, duh. I think that's a pretty easy answer, but let's ask some of the stuff that let's find out some stories. Let's hear stuff that doesn't normally get asked. I think people would like to be able to identify more with the drivers if they can get a story that kind of anchors them to that more, like you would have, like we had, in AJ and JR and Al Unser, and I mean all those guys. It's a little bit harder these days because of social media that wasn't around then, but yeah, it's like trying to tell the stories, and I think that's what you're doing. So how often do you typically upload some videos up to your Traction Reaction channel there on YouTube?
Yeah, it obviously during race season there's a lot more, but if I don't have nothing to post, I mean, I might go 3 weeks without posting anything, because I just don't want to post gibberish up there. But like I did, it was a week and a half ago. I did 2 things right in a row because I was up at Road America, and I got some. They were up there for the runoffs, and I did a paddock cruise up at Road America, which I got a lot of hits on. But just a few days before, I did a thing on where there's a group on Facebook trying to generate more interest on Keokuk, Iowa. And so I did a kind of a video on Keokuk on that group, as well as the guys, the Don Whites, Ramo Stotts, the Blankenships, the Hutchersons, and that. Keokuk, Iowa, it's a town of about 10,000, give or take, 1,000 throughout the last 10, 15 years, if not more. And it's amazing how this little town right on the tip of the southeast tip of Iowa, has generated so many race car drivers. Don White, Ramo Stott, Lem and Gordon Blankenship, Dick and Ron Hutcherson, it's Ernie Durr. It's just incredible how many stock car racing champions and whatnot. So I did a little video on that, and I unfortunately didn't get the hits you would think you would get on that. I got more hits on the Road America one, but go figure. But go Keokuk, and if it's something gives me interests me, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do a video later this week on something historical, but it's usually something I go, hey, that's right, I should do something on that. So we'll see what I come up with.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, man, because I haven't gotten through all of your videos, but I do really enjoy the stuff that you post
Well,
up there,
thank
and
you.
I'm just thinking, you're very welcome. And when you talk about places like Keokuk, I mean, yeah, Ramo Stott's the first name that comes to my mind, on that. And then as you're talking about those sorts of things, and I think about, oh, well, what about DuQuoin? What about Springfield? Maybe there's a Trenton in there somewhere or something like that, because there's so many of these great tracks. And I mean, I know a lot of the younger listeners and viewers kind of don't get that because most of those tracks don't get run anymore. Even the fairgrounds here in Indy, they closed that down a few years ago,
Mm-hmm.
so that doesn't run run anymore, but it's like, some of these cool tracks that, when you see some of those iconic photos, like AJ and Mario going wheel to wheel in a sprint car at DeCoin, or, Parnelli, or any of those guys, or, when JR got flipped over the fence and his arms are hanging out in midair, stuff like that. Those are the kinds of things that, that you're tackling that I think is awesome, because, like you, I appreciate that history of motorsport. So kudos to you, man. Keep that up.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. It's a labor of love. It really is, and I've been blessed to have a lot of good mentors growing up, and and seeing these young guys coming out down in India that are on YouTube and that. A couple of them were kind of getting harassed and whatnot, and weren't getting credentialed, and I went to bat for them. I said, this is the new generation, this is the new media, and you got to embrace it. So, and it I guess I was right on that, because they're a lot more successful than they were a few years ago, but they're the future. And I'm seeing a lot of young kids in IndyCar, especially. We saw at the memorabilia show down in Indianapolis, and there's always a concern, and I know you and I have always have this concern. You wonder where the future is coming from, and you go to a USAC sprint car race, or you go to certain races, you look around, and hey, I'm the youngest guy here, and I'm pushing 60, and there's a lot of older guys, but thankfully, with the IndyCar demographics have been, I think, coming down with thing, and they got a lot of younger people involved. So I guess that's a good thing, and they gotta keep embracing those guys, and keeping the racing relevant. I think IMSA is doing a great job with that too. Embracing
Imps is doing
kids,
a really good
especially
job.
IMSA is doing a great job with the kids too. It's amazing, with this Rexy, with that Porsche, how much that generates. And I think a lot of people in auto racing don't understand what type of a following that silly car, that everybody over the age of 50 doesn't pay attention to. But every kid, if he's ever been on the internet, has probably seen that car. It's amazing.
Well, and
So
seeing the dinosaur that's in the costume, at all those events,
yeah, yeah.
right around it all the time too. So yeah, they're establishing that brand loyalty, right? You'd recognize
Hmm.
and know that car anytime you saw it. So, all right, my friend, there's so much more that we could talk about that I would love to be able to talk with you about. And we've already gone over an hour, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. But perhaps if you're up for it, we could do some other shows here moving forward, and we can kind of hone in on some specific teams or events or things like that. If you'd be so kind and so be willing to do that sort of thing, because I know we literally barely just scratched the surface here in the time that we've had today. But if you're up for that, I know I'm
Oh, we
completely down
certainly
for
are.
that.
Yeah, I mean, especially even with the Harry Miller Club, which I'm heavily involved with.
I know.
Would love to talk to you about that. We barely scratched the surface on that. So, for those wondering,
Yeah.
it's a vintage IndyCar event that we do at the Milwaukee Mile, and we have it in. Once again, we're back on our traditional date. It's going to be the weekend after the 4th of July. This year, there's no conflicts with other vintage events, so we're looking forward to that, and supporting all the vintage events in the Midwest coming up this summer. So feel free to look us up, and we're all over the internet on Facebook and that. But yeah, the Harry Miller Club. We usually get anywhere from between 45 and 60 vintage Indy cars, and they run. We get a lot of car owners that come out there that love that event, because they'll put more laps on the racetrack there than any other event that they run at. So
That's right. Because actually, they're built for an oval. Most of those guys that guys like Ted Warner,
right.
that's got the Swede Savage car. He's like, whenever they go to like Long Beach and other road courses, the car is just miserable to drive because it's not set up to turn left and right. So,
Yes.
all right, my friend, it has been an honor and a great pleasure to have you on today. And again, I know that we've barely scratched the surface on stuff, but I'm so excited to be able to continue our conversation and do some other shows together. Hopefully, now that my schedule's kind of winding down for the season, we can actually catch up and catch each other in person. Maybe when you're in town here at Charlie Brown's, or when I'm up in West Dallas, since I still have my kids up there. So, thanks very much, dude. I so appreciate your time on the show today. Keep up the great work, and I can't wait for our next conversation. It's awesome. Did we lose you? All right, Seventh Gear Overhead fans. I know we just kind of lost our boy Steve Zautke there right at the end, but what a fantastic talk with him about just everything that he's got his hands on and what he's seen and experienced, and kind of get his take on spirits at the Speedway. So, again, big thanks to our show partners, KrausMeats.com, makers of those fine handcrafted and artisan sausages and meats, always top quality since 1923. Make sure that you check out their website at krausmeats.com and take advantage of their new lower pricing as we move into the holiday gift giving season. It's a perfect gift everybody eats, right? As well as our great friends and partners over at Dick Carriers and respectyourpackage.com, makers of those fantastic breathable high-end men's underwear. If you put in the discount code respect7, you'll get 20% off of your entire order. And boy, we've got so much more on deck. We're going to get into some motorsports marketing with some folks here over the next couple of weeks, including our good friend Kelly Flieger over at P1 Web Development, and sort of the godfather of modern motorsports marketing, Ralph Howard Hansen. And there's so much more. So make sure you subscribe, hit that subscribe button so we can keep pushing towards that 1,000 subscriber mark. Share us with your friends, rate us, review us. You know the drill. Smash that subscribe button and stay tuned for the latest in the greatest spectacle in podcasting. See ya.